In the early hours of August 13th, 2018, something inside a quiet suburban home would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, and that would soon grip the entire country with disbelief. From the outside, everything about that house suggested stability, routine, and a carefully built life. A growing family, a seemingly devoted husband, and a future that appeared mapped out with certainty. But the most disturbing stories rarely begin with chaos. They begin with silence, with moments that feel ordinary, almost forgettable, until they are revisited under a completely different light. At approximately 1:48 in the morning, Shanann Watts returned home to Frederick, Colorado after a business trip to Arizona, dropped off by a close friend who had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty, and the house waiting in darkness. Inside, Chris Watts was there with their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, and nothing about that moment seemed out of place. It should have been just another night, the kind that fades into memory without leaving a trace, but instead, it would become the final confirmed moment before everything unraveled. By the time morning approached, subtle signs began to emerge that something was not right, though no one could yet understand how serious it was. Hours passed, and what should have been routine quickly turned into concern. When Shanann failed to respond to messages and missed an important medical appointment, the unease felt by those closest to her began to grow into something much heavier. A close friend, familiar with her habits and her reliability, sensed immediately that this was not normal behavior, that something had interrupted the pattern of her life in a way that could not be easily explained. As the morning turned into midday, that concern transformed into action, setting in motion a sequence of events that would bring law enforcement to the front door of that seemingly perfect home. What they would soon discover inside would raise more questions than answers, because even though everything appeared intact at first glance, the silence inside that house carried a weight that could not be ignored, and it was only the beginning of a story that would grow darker with every passing hour. As the morning of August 13th continued, what began as a simple concern quickly escalated into something far more serious, driven by a feeling that refused to go away. Shanann Watts was not someone who disappeared without explanation, and those who knew her understood that immediately. When she failed to attend a scheduled medical appointment and stopped responding to calls and messages, it set off an internal alarm that could not be ignored. Her close friend, who had dropped her off just hours earlier, began to retrace every step, trying to make sense of something that did not add up. By late morning, that concern turned into urgency, and at approximately 12:10 in the afternoon, she arrived at the house in Frederick, Colorado, expecting to find a simple explanation waiting on the other side of the door. But when repeated knocks went unanswered, and the door remained closed, the silence became something far more unsettling, something that hinted that whatever had happened inside that house was not normal. Unable to reach anyone and growing increasingly anxious, she contacted Chris Watts, who was at work at the time, and shortly after, a call was made to the local police requesting a welfare check. At approximately 1:40 in the afternoon, an officer arrived at the property, stepping into a situation that, at first glance, seemed calm but carried an undercurrent of something deeply wrong. With permission to enter the home, the officer began a walkthrough, quickly noticing details that did not align with a typical voluntary disappearance. The family dog was inside, unharmed and alone, moving through the house as if waiting for its owners to return. Shannon's personal belongings, including her phone and keys, were still there, left behind in a way that suggested she had never intended to go anywhere. Her car remained in the garage, the children's car seats still in place, untouched. And then one detail stood out above all the others, something small but deeply unsettling: her wedding ring found resting on the bed. It was a quiet detail, almost easy to overlook. But in that moment, it became impossible to ignore, because it suggested that whatever had happened, it was not planned, and it was not voluntary, leaving behind a single, haunting question that no one could yet answer. As investigators and officers continued to move through the home in Frederick, Colorado, the silence inside began to feel heavier with every step, as if the walls themselves were holding on to something that had not yet been revealed. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, nothing obviously broken or out of place, yet everything felt wrong in a way that could not be easily explained. The house looked lived in, paused in the middle of an ordinary day that had suddenly stopped without warning. Personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been, and every detail pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. Shanann Watts had not planned to leave, and neither had her children. The normal signs of a voluntary disappearance were completely absent, replaced instead by a quiet stillness that raised more questions than answers. It was the kind of scene that, to an experienced eye, suggested that whatever had happened did not happen far away, but right there within those walls. While officers processed the scene, attention inevitably shifted toward Chris Watts, the last known adult to have seen Shanann alive. At first, there was nothing overtly alarming in his behavior, but there was something subtle, something difficult to define, that began to stand out the longer the situation unfolded. As concern turned into the early stages of an investigation, he would soon find himself at the center of growing suspicion, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of the accumulation of small details that did not seem to align. Outside the home, cameras would soon capture him speaking publicly, asking for the safe return of his wife and daughters, presenting himself as a worried husband desperate for answers. But even as those words were being spoken, something beneath the surface did not sit right with those watching closely. And as the hours passed, investigators would begin to look deeper, knowing that in cases like this, the truth often hides behind the most ordinary appearances, waiting for the moment when it can no longer stay hidden. As the investigation began to gain momentum, the quiet suburban street in Frederick, Colorado transformed into the center of growing media attention, with cameras, reporters, and investigators all focused on a single question: where was Shanann Watts and her two daughters? It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Chris Watts stepped forward to speak publicly, standing just outside his home as cameras rolled and microphones captured every word. His voice appeared calm, almost controlled, as he described the situation, asking for his wife and children to come back home, insisting that he had no idea where they were. To many watching, it seemed like a husband desperate for answers, a father clinging to hope. But to others, especially those trained to read behavior under pressure, something about the delivery felt unusual, not overtly alarming, but just enough to create a sense that something did not fully align with the gravity of the situation. As he spoke, investigators continued working behind the scenes, analyzing every detail, every timeline, and every inconsistency, no matter how small. Search teams moved through the area, and trained dogs were brought onto the property, their presence adding a visible intensity to the unfolding situation. What had started as a welfare check was now evolving into a full-scale investigation, drawing in additional agencies, including state and federal authorities, all working to piece together what had happened in the narrow window of time between the early morning hours and the moment concern was raised. The more attention the case received, the more pressure began to build, not only from law enforcement but from the public as well, all watching closely as the story developed in real time. And while Chris Watts continued to present himself as cooperative and concerned, investigators were beginning to look beyond the surface, focusing on the details that did not quite fit, because in cases like this, it is often not what is said but what is missing that leads to the truth, and that truth was getting closer with every passing hour, behind closed doors, away from cameras and public perception. The tone of the investigation began to shift as Chris Watts was brought in for questioning. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was controlled, quiet, and deliberate, a stark contrast to the growing media storm outside. Investigators were no longer just looking at a missing persons case. They were carefully analyzing behavior, timing, and inconsistencies, building a psychological picture piece by piece. At first, his demeanor remained steady, cooperative, even calm, as he repeated the same version of events, insisting he had last seen Shanann Watts in the early morning before leaving for work. But in an environment designed to observe even the smallest shifts, subtle cracks began to appear. His body language, the way he spoke, the pauses between answers, everything was being watched, measured, and quietly noted by those in the room. As the questioning continued, investigators introduced a polygraph examination, a moment that often becomes a turning point in cases like this. Chris Watts agreed to take the test, maintaining the same composed posture, but the results told a different story. When confronted with the outcome, which indicated deception, the dynamic in the room changed instantly. The calm repetition of earlier statements was no longer enough, and the pressure began to build in a way that could not be ignored. It was then that he made a request that would shift everything, asking to speak with his father before continuing. That moment, quiet on the surface, carried a weight that investigators recognized immediately, because in cases like this, confessions rarely come out of nowhere. They build slowly, under pressure, until the truth can no longer stay contained. And as that pressure reached its peak, what he would say next would begin to unravel the version of events he had held on to, opening the door to a reality far darker than anyone had yet confirmed. When Chris Watts finally sat down with his father inside that interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted in a way that investigators had been anticipating. The controlled pressure, the inconsistencies, and the weight of the evidence had been building toward this exact moment. What followed was not an immediate full confession, but something more complex, a version of events that attempted to explain the unexplainable while still holding onto fragments of denial. In a low and controlled voice, he claimed that an argument had taken place, one that escalated beyond control, and then came the statement that would momentarily redirect the narrative. He alleged that Shanann Watts had harmed their daughters, and that in a sudden reaction, driven by rage and shock, he had strangled her. It was a story that, on the surface, offered an explanation, but to experienced investigators, it immediately raised more questions than it answered, because it did not fully align with the evidence beginning to take shape. Even within that partial confession, there were gaps, details that felt constructed rather than recalled, and elements that did not match the behavioral patterns being observed. Investigators listened carefully, allowing him to speak, understanding that in moments like this, the first version is rarely the complete truth. What mattered was not just what he said, but how he said it, the hesitation, the structure, and the subtle contradictions embedded within his words. As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that this was not the full story, but rather the beginning of something unraveling under pressure. Behind the scenes, teams were already working to verify every detail, to match his statements against physical evidence, timelines, and search results that were beginning to narrow in on a specific location. And as that process moved forward, one thing became certain. Whatever had happened that morning did not end inside that house, and the next step in the investigation would lead authorities to a place far removed from the quiet suburban street, a place where the truth had been deliberately hidden, waiting to be discovered. As investigators began to act on the information gathered during the interrogation, their focus shifted to a remote work site linked to Chris Watts, a location owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. It was an isolated area, far removed from the quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, a place where heavy machinery operated and where few people would think to look without a specific reason. But by this point, investigators had begun to connect the timeline, and that location quickly became central to the search. On August 16th, authorities arrived at the site, fully aware that what they might find could confirm their worst suspicions. The stillness of the area contrasted sharply with the gravity of the situation, and as the search began, every movement carried a growing sense of inevitability. It did not take long before that sense turned into confirmation, as evidence began to emerge that this was not just a missing persons case, but something far more devastating. What they discovered at that site would shock even seasoned investigators. The bodies of the two young girls, Bella and Celeste, were found hidden inside separate oil tanks, concealed in a way that reflected a deliberate attempt to delay discovery. Nearby, in a shallow grave, lay the body of Shanann Watts, ending any remaining hope that this case might have a different outcome. The reality of what had happened was now undeniable, and the full weight of the crime began to settle over everyone involved in the investigation. What had once been presented as confusion and concern was now exposed as something calculated and irreversible. As the evidence was documented and the scene secured, the case took a decisive turn, shifting from investigation to prosecution. And while the discoveries answered the most urgent question of where they were, they opened an even darker one that investigators would continue to pursue. How someone who had appeared to live such an ordinary life could commit an act so profoundly disturbing, and what had truly happened in those final hours before everything was lost. With the discovery of the bodies, the case against Chris Watts shifted dramatically, and the version of events he had previously offered began to collapse under the weight of physical evidence. What had once been a narrative filled with confusion and partial explanations was now confronted with undeniable facts that could not be reshaped or avoided. Investigators no longer needed to rely solely on statements or behavioral analysis. They now had a crime scene, a timeline, and a clear connection between his actions and the location where the bodies were found. As the pressure intensified, it became increasingly difficult for him to maintain the earlier story he had told, and slowly, piece by piece, a more complete and disturbing account began to surface. This was no longer about a sudden reaction or a single moment of rage, but something far more deliberate, something that pointed to a sequence of decisions made over time. As questioning continued and the investigation deepened, Chris Watts began to reveal details that painted a far darker picture of what had happened inside the home and afterward. He admitted that he had been involved in an affair, a detail that introduced a possible motive and added another layer to the case. What had once appeared to be a stable family life was now being re-examined under a completely different perspective, one where hidden tensions and personal choices may have played a critical role. According to his statements, the events of that morning followed a confrontation about separation, a moment that would ultimately lead to irreversible actions. But even as more details came forward, the emotional weight of the case continued to grow, not only because of what had been done, but because of who the victims were. And as investigators worked to document every element, one question remained at the center of it all: how much of this had been planned and how much had unfolded in a moment, because the answer to that question would shape everything that came next. As investigators worked to reconstruct the final hours inside the house in Frederick, Colorado, the sequence of events described by Chris Watts revealed a timeline that was both disturbing and difficult to comprehend. According to his later statements, the confrontation between him and Shanann Watts took place shortly after she returned home in the early morning hours, a conversation that centered around separation and the future of their relationship. What began as a discussion quickly escalated into something irreversible, and in that moment, he admitted to strangling her. But what made the situation even more unsettling was what happened next, because the events did not end there, and the presence of the children would soon become a central part of the unfolding tragedy. In his account, one of the daughters entered the room during or shortly after the confrontation, witnessing a scene no child should ever see. In an attempt to control the situation, he told her that her mother was unwell, creating a moment of false reassurance that would only deepen the horror of what followed. He then described placing the body of Shanann Watts into his work truck along with his two daughters, driving away from the home as the sun began to rise. Inside that vehicle, during the drive to the remote site, the situation escalated further, leading to the suffocation of the children one after the other. These details, as they emerged, painted a chilling picture of calculated actions carried out over a period of time, rather than a single moment of loss of control. And as investigators documented every aspect of this timeline, the emotional weight of the case became even heavier, because it revealed not just what had been done, but how it had unfolded step by step, leaving behind a sequence of events that would be nearly impossible to forget. With the full scope of the crime now established, prosecutors moved quickly to formally charge Chris Watts, transforming the case from investigation into a legal battle that would determine the rest of his life. On August 21st, he was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, including separate charges for each victim, as well as an additional count related to the death of an unborn child. Beyond that, he faced charges for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy and multiple counts of tampering with deceased human bodies, each one reflecting a different aspect of the actions that had taken place. The weight of these charges was overwhelming, not only because of their severity, but because of the evidence already gathered to support them. In court, the details of the case began to take on a more structured form, with timelines, forensic findings, and documented statements all being presented as part of a growing body of proof that pointed directly at him. As the legal process moved forward, bail became a critical point of discussion, initially denied due to the seriousness of the charges and the risk involved. At a later hearing, bail was set at $5 million, a figure that reflected both the gravity of the case and the concern that he might attempt to flee. The courtroom became another stage, where the reality of the situation unfolded, with each hearing adding another layer to the public understanding of what had happened. Meanwhile, the case continued to draw national attention, not only because of the nature of the crime, but because it fit into a rare and deeply disturbing category often referred to as family annihilation, a term used to describe cases in which an individual destroys their own family unit. As legal teams prepared for what could have been a prolonged trial, one possibility loomed over everything: the potential for the death penalty, a factor that would soon play a crucial role in shaping the decisions that followed and the outcome that no one could yet fully predict. As the case moved closer to trial, the weight of the evidence against Chris Watts became impossible to ignore, not only for investigators, but for the defense as well. What had once been a situation filled with questions was now supported by confessions, forensic findings, and a timeline that left little room for doubt. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, a decision had to be made, one that would ultimately shape the final outcome of the case. Behind the scenes, discussions began to take place between prosecutors and the defense, focusing on the possibility of a plea agreement. For the family of Shanann Watts, the process was not just about legal consequences, but about closure, about avoiding a prolonged trial that would force them to relive every detail of what had happened. In a case already filled with unimaginable loss, the idea of extending that pain became a central factor in what would happen next. On November 6, 2018, that decision became official when Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including the murders of his wife and children. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty, honoring the wishes of Shanann's family. It was a moment that brought a form of resolution, but not relief, because no legal outcome could undo what had been done. The plea eliminated the need for a trial, but it also meant that many details would never be explored in a courtroom setting, leaving some questions unanswered. Even so, the admission of guilt marked a turning point, shifting the focus from proving the crime to determining the punishment. And as the court prepared for sentencing, the reality of what he had admitted to began to settle in fully, not only for those directly affected, but for everyone who had followed the case, knowing that the next step would bring a final judgment, one that would define the rest of his life. On November 19th, 2018, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the final sentence was delivered, bringing a legal conclusion to a case that had shocked the nation. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, 3 of them to be served consecutively and 2 concurrently, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In addition to those sentences, he received decades more for the unlawful termination of Shanann Watts' pregnancy and for multiple counts related to the concealment of the bodies. Each part of the sentence reflected not just the number of victims, but the nature of the crimes themselves, calculated, deliberate, and carried out over a period of time. As the judge outlined the terms, the full weight of the legal system came down in a way that left no room for appeal in the eyes of the public, closing the door on any possibility of freedom. Despite the finality of the sentence, the emotional impact of the case continued to linger far beyond the courtroom. The decision not to pursue the death penalty, made at the request of Shanann's family, stood as a powerful reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, their focus was not on further death, but on ending the process and preventing more pain. Shortly after the sentencing, Chris Watts was transferred out of state due to safety concerns, eventually arriving at a maximum security facility where he would remain indefinitely. But while the legal chapter had come to an end, the case itself left behind a series of questions that extended beyond the facts, questions about motive, about psychology, and about how something like this could happen within a family that, to the outside world, appeared completely normal. And as time passed, those questions would continue to draw attention, keeping the story alive long after the sentence had been handed down. Even after the sentencing, one question refused to fade. What could drive someone like Chris Watts to commit such an unthinkable act? On the surface, his life had appeared stable, structured, and even predictable. A working husband, a father, a man who blended into routine without drawing attention. But as the case was examined more deeply, layers began to emerge that suggested a far more complex reality beneath that calm exterior. Investigators and analysts started to look beyond the timeline of the crime itself, focusing instead on behavior, personality traits, and the possibility of a hidden internal conflict that had been building long before that night. His extramarital affair became a central piece of that puzzle, not just as a motive, but as a turning point, a moment where his life began to divide into two separate paths, one public and one private, each moving in completely different directions. Experts in criminal behavior often refer to cases like this as family annihilation, a rare but deeply disturbing phenomenon where an individual destroys their own family, often in an attempt to escape a reality they feel unable to control. What makes these cases even more complex is that they rarely present clear warning signs to those on the outside, allowing the individual to maintain the appearance of normalcy until the moment everything collapses. In many instances, these crimes are followed by the perpetrator taking their own life, an ending that did not occur in this case, though Chris Watts would later claim he had considered it. This deviation added another layer of complexity, raising further questions about intent, control, and the sequence of decisions that led to that morning. And as people continued to analyze the case, trying to understand not just what happened, but why, it became clear that some aspects might never be fully explained, leaving behind a sense of unease that continues to surround the story even years later. Even with a confession, a clear timeline, and a final sentence, the case of Chris Watts left behind a series of unanswered questions that continue to disturb those who study it. Some details never fully aligned, and others were never explored in depth due to the plea agreement that avoided a full trial. What exactly was going through his mind in those final hours, and at what point did the situation shift from thought to action? Was it something planned over time, or a series of irreversible decisions made in rapid succession? These are the kinds of questions that linger, not because there are no clues, but because the answers that do exist are incomplete, filtered through the words of the very person responsible. And in cases like this, the truth is often fragmented, shaped by what is said, what is omitted, and what can never be verified. For many, what makes this case so unsettling is not just the crime itself, but the contrast between appearance and reality. To neighbors, friends, and even casual observers, the family seemed normal, even happy, a reflection of a life that followed a familiar and comforting pattern. Yet behind that image, something else was unfolding, something hidden, quiet, and ultimately destructive. The idea that such a drastic break from normalcy could occur without clear warning signs challenges the way people understand those around them, forcing a deeper reflection on how well anyone can truly know another person. And as time continues to pass, the case remains a reference point in discussions about trust, perception, and the hidden complexities of human behavior, leaving behind a lingering sense that, despite everything that has been revealed, there is still something about this story that feels incomplete, as if the final piece of the puzzle was never fully uncovered. Years after the events of August 13th, 2018, the case of Chris Watts continues to resonate in a way few cases do, not because of mystery alone, but because of the disturbing clarity of what happened. The details are known, the outcome is final, and yet the impact remains. It is a case that forces people to confront an uncomfortable reality, that appearances can be deceiving, and that even the most ordinary lives can hide something far darker beneath the surface. The story of Shanann Watts and her children is no longer just a timeline of events, but a lasting reminder of how quickly everything can change, how a single day can redefine an entire narrative, turning what once seemed like a normal life into something unimaginable. But beyond the facts, beyond the investigation and the legal outcome, what remains is the human element, the lives lost, and the questions that continue to echo long after the case was closed. For those who followed the story, it becomes more than just another true crime case. It becomes something that lingers, something that stays with you, not because of what is unknown, but because of what is known. The final chapter may have been written in a courtroom, but the story itself continues in the minds of those who revisit it, analyze it, and try to understand it. And perhaps that is what makes it so unforgettable, not just the tragedy, but the realization that sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones filled with mystery, but the ones where the truth is fully revealed, leaving behind a silence that speaks louder than anything else.